Hi, and welcome to Sleepy Roman History. If you're listening to this at night, I hope it helps you unwind. Please like and subscribe, it means so much to me. Where in the world are you watching from and what time is it? It's so nice to think that wherever we are, we're sharing this moment together. The village was quiet as dusk fell, the sky painted in soft pastels of lavender and pale rose. A gentle breeze rustled the thatched roofs and stirred the leaves of the linden trees lining the dirt road. Chickens clucked faintly in the distance, retreating to their coops as the day gave way to evening. Lanterns flickered to life, casting warm circles of golden light on cobblestone paths. Somewhere beyond the fields, a cow lowed sleepily. In the heart of the village, tucked between a cooper's shop and a weaver's cottage, stood a timber-framed tavern. Its beams were dark and slightly warped with age, its wattle and daub walls painted with soot and time. Above the door hung a wooden sign etched with a faded symbol, an ox pulling a cart, its paint worn by years of wind and rain. A soft yellow glow seeped from the tavern's small windows, and the muffled sounds of voices drifted into the cool evening air. Laughter, gentle and low, mixed with the clinking of pottery and the occasional creak of the floorboards inside. The door creaked open with a long sigh, revealing the dimly lit interior. A heavy scent lingered in the air, thick with smoke from the hearth, the tang of ale and the must of old wood. Candles flickered in iron sconces, their wax pooling slowly into uneven lumps. At the far end of the room, a wide stone fireplace glowed with red-orange coals, its flames dancing lazily. The fire popped quietly, sending occasional sparks into the hooded chimney. Benches lined the room, their surfaces smoothed by countless years of use. Tables stood low and wide, stained with rings of spilled drink and carved with initials. The tavern's walls leaned in slightly, as if listening to the whispered stories they'd absorbed over generations. A stout innkeeper moved slowly between tables, his linen apron dusted with flour and soot. He nodded warmly at the guests, a cloth slung over his shoulder, a pitcher of ale in one hand. His face was weathered, his hair greying and his eyes kind. Behind him, a narrow door led to the kitchen, where the scent of stewed vegetables and roasting meat drifted from a large pot hanging over a fire. The guests were varied and quiet. A farmer with hands calloused by plough and spade sipped from a wooden mug. His boots were muddy, and his coat smelled faintly of the fields. Beside him, a tanner in a stiff leather jerkin leaned back against the wall, staring into the fire, lost in thought. A woman in a simple woolen dress sat by the hearth, her eyes closed, her hands wrapped around a cup of spiced wine. She might have been a seamstress or the wife of a miller. No one seemed to mind either way. In the corner, a travelling minstrel gently plucked the strings of a small harp. The notes were soft and low, not meant to entertain but to soothe. His voice, when it rose, was more like a murmur than a song, telling of a lost lover who waited beneath the stars. No one clapped when he paused. There was no need. A group of children peered in through the tavern's window, wide-eyed and giggling, only to scatter as the innkeeper spotted them and waved them off with a gruff smile. Outside, the street lay empty now, lit by moonlight and the occasional torch. Crickets began to sing from the grassy edges of the road, their voices rising and falling in the cool night. Inside, time seemed slower. The hearth was the heartbeat of the room, its warmth soaking into stone walls and tired bodies. Conversation moved at a gentle pace, interrupted by long silences, broken only by the occasional creak of the door or the thud of a tankard placed softly on wood. Above the main room, a set of stairs led to narrow sleeping quarters. Simple wooden rooms with straw-filled mattresses and woolen blankets awaited the few travellers staying overnight. The smell of dried herbs hung in the air, lavender and chamomile tucked into corners to keep mice away and offer a touch of sweetness to the dreams of strangers. The tavern, like many others across the countryside, was more than just a place to drink. It was a resting place, a quiet hearth, a shared breath between travellers and villagers alike. In its smoky air and its worn floorboards lived the stories of 1,000 evenings, gently echoing through time. And as the night deepened and the stars slowly appeared one by one above the thatched roof, the tavern sighed quietly to itself, content in the rhythm of the world outside its doors. The evening deepened, and with it, the tavern seemed to settle further into itself. The light from the fire thickened the shadows, drawing the walls closer and making every corner feel safe and enclosed. The heat from the hearth gently warmed the soles of travellers' boots and the backs of their hands. Occasionally, someone would shift their seat, dragging a bench a few inches closer to the flames with a slow wooden scrape. The innkeeper's wife emerged from the kitchen, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, cheeks rosy from the warmth of the cooking fire. In her arms was a tray of bowls filled with stew, turnips, onions and barley swimming in a thin, flavourful broth. She set each bowl down with quiet efficiency, pausing to refill mugs or brush crumbs from a tabletop. Her presence was comforting, like a thick blanket or a warm loaf of bread. At one table, a merchant from a nearby town unfolded a bit of parchment. He read softly by candlelight, the edges of his paper curling from the heat. He wore a thick cloak over his shoulders, the hood pushed back to reveal silvering hair and thoughtful eyes. The flicker of candlelight danced across the ink, casting gentle reflections on the wooden table, where his untouched bowl of stew slowly cooled. Opposite him, an old shepherd rested his head in his hands. His staff leaned against the wall beside him, worn smooth by decades of use. The lines on his face were deep, like riverbeds, and his eyes remained fixed on the fire as if tracing old memories. No one disturbed him. He belonged to the quiet here, like the smoke curling toward the rafters or the dust that stirred when someone crossed the floor. There were few spoken words, and none were loud. When guests did speak, it was in soft tones, the kind used at a bedside or by candlelight. Occasionally, a joke would pass between friends, and their laughter would drift up, mellow and warm, like steam from a pot. It mingled with the low notes of the minstrel's harp, which continued to hum gently from the corner. By the window, a young couple shared a bench. Their hands rested close, but not touching. She wore a simple green shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and he held a wooden cup, turning it slowly in his hands. They did not speak, and they didn't need to. Their silence was full of meaning, as soft and steady as the beat of a heart. Outside, the moon climbed higher, casting silver across the window panes. Beyond the glass, the village slept. The scent of the stew mixed with old oak and cooling stone. Beeswax candles melted in iron holders, their light golden and calm. The innkeeper's wife replaced them one by one as they grew short, never letting the room fall too dim. Her motions were practiced and quiet, each gesture a part of the tavern's rhythm. Up in the rafters, a cat slinked across a wooden beam, its paws making no sound as it surveyed the room. It yawned, stretched, then curled into a patch of shadow above the hearth. No one noticed, or perhaps no one minded. It was not the only creature that had found shelter in the tavern tonight. In the kitchen, the fire had burned low, and the remaining bread loaves were stacked neatly in a basket lined with cloth. A clay jug of honey sat beside a bundle of mint leaves, their scent faint and soothing. The innkeeper prepared a simple drink with the herbs, pouring hot water into earthen cups and setting them down for the few who stayed later than most. Outside the door, the village street lay empty. The stars shimmered above in great clusters, and a hush settled over the fields. No dogs barked, no carts rolled by. Only the whisper of wind in the eaves and the occasional sigh of someone shifting in their chair kept time with the night. Back inside, the guests began to doze. The shepherd leaned back with his eyes closed. The couple near the window rested their foreheads together, breathing in tandem. The merchant had folded his parchment and laid his head on his arm. The minstrel's harp fell silent, but he remained in his corner, nodding slowly, with eyes half shut. The tavern held them all in its quiet embrace, each breath and heartbeat softened by the weight of sleep. The fire burned low, its embers glowing faintly beneath the iron kettle. Smoke drifted lazily toward the chimney, and in its gentle ascent, the dreams of the tavern's guests began to take shape. The morning had not yet stirred, but the night had settled fully. Inside the tavern, the stillness held like a warm blanket draped over the beams and tables. Every creak, every breath was a part of the hush, like pages turning in a forgotten book. The hearth glowed faintly, its embers dim but persistent, keeping the room wrapped in a soft cocoon of heat. Then, gently, the door pushed open. It creaked low and long, not with alarm, but with the familiar slowness of old hinges and weathered wood. A figure entered, outlined for a moment by the moonlight behind him. He stepped inside, and the door closed again, the latch falling into place with a quiet click. He was a traveller, that much was clear. A long cloak clung to his shoulders, its hem damp with dew. A leather satchel hung from one side, and a walking staff, worn smooth, rested in his hand. Dust marked his boots, and a faint smell of pine and earth followed him in. His face was lined from wind and time, but his eyes were gentle, curious rather than weary. He stood still for a moment, as though listening to the hush around him. The glow from the hearth painted the side of his face with gold, and the faintest curl of a smile touched his lips. Then, without a word, he made his way to the bench nearest the fire and sat, laying his staff gently beside him. The innkeeper, who had been dozing near the kitchen, rose without surprise. He knew the sound of a guest who belonged. Moving slowly, he retrieved a fresh cup and filled it with warm mead, laced with spices, and just enough honey to soothe a tired throat. Without speaking, he set it in front of the traveller, then nodded once and returned to his seat. The traveller wrapped his fingers around the cup. It was warm, and the steam that rose smelled faintly of cloves and cinnamon. He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. No questions were asked. No introductions were required. In the language of the road, his arrival was answer enough. One by one, the sleeping guests stirred, not with alarm, but with the subtle shifts of people sensing another's presence. The shepherd opened one eye, then closed it again. The minstrel adjusted his cloak and hummed a single soft note before falling quiet once more. The couple near the window leaned into each other and continued their dreaming, undisturbed. The traveller took a sip from his cup. The mead was smooth and sweet, the warmth of it spreading slowly through his limbs. He reached into his satchel and pulled free a small cloth pouch. Untying it carefully, he spilled a few nuts and dried berries into his palm. He ate slowly, watching the fire, content to be in the company of silence. The tavern accepted him, as it had accepted countless others before him. It did not ask where he had come from or where he was going. The road had brought him here, and the fire would keep him until it was time to leave again. Outside, the wind passed softly through the trees. The moon dipped lower, and the stars, still bright, seemed to watch with quiet approval. The thatched roofs of the village glistened with frost, and the air carried the clean scent of the coming dawn. Inside, the traveller finished his cup and leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire reach his bones. A cat leapt down from the rafters and padded over to him, curling at his feet without hesitation. He smiled and reached down, brushing a hand gently across its back. In the world of roads and seasons, of weather and distance, there were few places where time slowed like this. The tavern, tucked between the dark of the trees and the soft light of the hearth, was one of them. Here, for a while, a traveller could rest without explanation. The fire would burn, the night would hold, and morning would come when it was ready. The tavern did not mark time as the outside world did. Inside its walls, the hours unfolded like parchment curling at the edges, slow and curling, shaped more by the drift of conversation and the warmth of embers than by sun or clock. The fire crackled low, and the room breathed with the soft rhythm of sleeping guests and gentle footfalls. The traveller remained near the hearth. His cloak hung from a peg on the wall now, steaming faintly as the dampness lifted into the warm air. His boots rested beside the bench, and he sat cross-legged, nursing a second cup of mead. The innkeeper had not spoken a word, nor had he needed to. In this tavern, understanding came through smaller gestures: a nod, a refill, a hand placed briefly on a shoulder. At the edge of the fire's light, the minstrel stirred. He opened his eyes slowly, then reached for his harp, fingers moving over the strings with practiced ease. A quiet tune began, slow and aimless, like a memory that hadn't fully formed. The melody drifted up into the rafters, mingling with the shadows and soft smoke, and wrapped the room in stillness. The traveller glanced toward the musician and offered a small, respectful smile. Then he reached into his satchel and pulled out a worn cloth bundle, unfolding it carefully on the table. Inside were objects from his journey: a carved wooden whistle, a bit of dyed thread, a coin with a hole in the centre, and a tiny piece of parchment with a symbol drawn in charcoal. One of the village men, who had been resting near the back wall, leaned forward slightly. His eyes studied the coin, its strange design unfamiliar to him. He tilted his head, then gestured softly. The traveller responded with a low voice, slow and even. He spoke of a market in a southern port, where the sea was blue and restless, and the coins clinked like songbirds in the palm. The coin had come from a sailor who paid for a ride on a muddy road after a storm had stranded him far inland. The traveller hadn't meant to keep it, but he did. Another guest, a woman in a thick woolen shawl, turned toward them, listening with quiet interest. Her hands were folded in her lap, her face lined but kind. She didn't interrupt, but her presence was an invitation for more. So the traveller continued. He spoke not as a bard or a showman, but simply, gently. He spoke of hills cloaked in morning fog, of mountain paths where the stones rattled beneath cartwheels, and of a boy in a distant village who gave him a ripe pear in exchange for a story about wolves. Each tale was brief, barely more than a sketch, but it was enough. Enough to feed the imagination and stir the quiet curiosity of those around him. The merchant by the candle nodded slowly. The innkeeper, leaning on the edge of the bar, rubbed his chin thoughtfully. No one applauded. No one raised a toast. That was not the tavern's way. The fire snapped softly, and the wind outside brushed the shutters. Inside, the warmth of shared silence deepened. At the end of his story, the traveller returned the coin to his satchel, folded the cloth, and tucked it away. The minstrel, inspired by the mood, began to hum a song with no words, only soft vowels and drifting notes. The sound blended with the low murmur of the fire, the slow breath of the room, the cat's quiet purr beneath the table. The woman in the shawl lifted her head and spoke next. Her voice was soft, and her tale older than the rest. It was not of places far away, but of her childhood, when the village still had only one well, and everyone gathered in the evenings to listen to her grandfather speak. She told of the long winter when the bread was thin, but the songs were thick and strong. Others followed. A story about a ghost that lived in the bell tower, told with a crooked grin. A memory of the last midsummer festival, when the baker's daughter danced until her feet were blistered. One by one, the guests offered their stories, some real, some shaped by time and telling. The traveller listened, smiling, sipping his mead slowly. He had brought stories into the tavern, but he would leave with more. That was the quiet trade of places like this, not goods or coins, but moments, names, the colours of skies in places never seen. And still, the fire glowed. The tavern held them all, safe, slow, and together. Above the main room, where the fire glowed low and the soft murmur of voices continued like water over stone, the tavern's upper floor lay hushed and dim. A narrow staircase creaked beneath careful steps. Its railing, polished smooth by decades of hands, curved gently along the wall, leading to a crooked hallway lit only by a single oil lamp set into a niche. The air upstairs was cooler than the hearth-lit room below. It carried the scent of dried herbs tucked along the rafters, lavender, sage, and a little rosemary. They hung in small bundles, tied with faded string, their stems brittle and still. The wooden beams arched low overhead, dark with age and warm to the eye. Soft dust danced in the air, barely visible in the lamp's sleepy glow. Each room upstairs was small and spare. A bed with a straw-stuffed mattress sat against the far wall, covered by a woolen blanket of deep brown or soft grey. A single stool or low bench might sit nearby, along with a small wooden chest for belongings. There were no mirrors, no glass, and only the barest of ornamentation. A clay cup stood on each windowsill, sometimes with a dried flower or a bit of tallow for late-night light. The windows were shuttered now, and beyond them the night whispered against the wood. Occasionally the cry of an owl stirred in the distance, and the sound drifted in like a visitor just passing through. In one room, a tanner's apprentice lay curled beneath his blanket, boots resting just inside the door. His pack was neatly stacked by the wall, with a strip of rough leather and a small worn knife beside it. His breathing was steady, the kind of sleep earned through hard work and long days. In another room, the couple from near the window downstairs now slept side by side. Her shawl had been folded beneath her head as a pillow, and his hand rested just near hers on the blanket. Their room was almost silent, save for the faint sound of their breathing and the occasional crack from the old beams as they settled. A merchant, older and careful, had propped a candle stub near his bedside, though it had long since gone out. His belongings were wrapped tightly in cloth and stored near his head. His dreams, perhaps, carried the shape of numbers and roads, of ledgers and distant cities. The traveller, too, had taken a room. He had not asked for one. The innkeeper had only gestured toward the stairs after a shared glance, and that had been enough. Now he sat quietly on the edge of the bed, removing his belt and laying it across the stool. His satchel remained within arm's reach. He poured a small amount of water from a ceramic jug into a bowl, then washed his face slowly, pressing the coolness into his skin. The window in his room was cracked slightly open. From it came the scent of damp wood and moss, along with the faintest stir of wind. He did not lie down at once. Instead, he stood by the window for a while, listening to the stillness outside. Somewhere far away, a church bell chimed twice. Its tone was soft and distant, like a memory folded between layers of sleep. In the hallway, the floor creaked gently under the cat's paws. It moved from room to room, inspecting the doors, stopping now and then to sit and listen. It knew the tavern well, and the people in it. It did not need permission to roam. This was its home too. The lamp in the hallway flickered once, then settled into a slow, steady burn. The shadows it cast stretched long against the wooden floor, drawing shapes that faded as quickly as they formed. Below, the fire's light barely reached the stairwell, but the warmth of it seemed to climb, resting lightly on the beams above. The air was still, but never stale. Every breath tasted of quiet. And as the tavern drifted deeper into night, every room upstairs sank into stillness. Blankets rose and fell with calm breaths. Boots rested neatly beside doors. Dreams unfolded in silence, like pages turning in soft candlelight. The world outside spun slowly on, distant and vast. But within these timbered walls, all was still. The stories, the songs, the warmth, all tucked in safely beneath the thatch, where sleep held every soul in peace. The earliest breath of dawn came not with sound, but with scent. Downstairs in the tavern's kitchen, a gentle heat began to stir before the sky had yet changed. The innkeeper's wife moved quietly through the gloom, her apron already tied, her sleeves rolled up. A small lantern flickered on the windowsill, its light just enough to shape her silhouette as she worked. She ground flour with practiced hands, the stone wheel creaking slowly as it turned. The dust of grain floated in the air, catching the golden lamp glow like soft mist. Her fingers moved through it without pause. Water was poured into a bowl, followed by the flour, then salt, and a spoonful of sour starter saved from the last batch. With slow strength, she kneaded the dough, folding it again and again until it was smooth and warm beneath her palms. Outside, the stars had not yet vanished, though they faded faintly behind a veil of silver in the east. A cockerel crowed somewhere beyond the fields, distant and drowsy. Inside, the tavern remained dim, save for the soft glow in the kitchen. Once the dough was set to rise, the innkeeper himself descended the stairs. His boots made a low thump with each step, his breath steady. He rubbed his face with a cloth and moved to the hearth, stoking the embers back to life. The fire sighed as dry wood caught and crackled gently, and a curl of smoke rose into the hooded chimney. He placed a blackened kettle over the flame. Soon, the scent of herbs steeping in hot water joined that of rising bread. Chamomile, lemon balm, and a sprig of mint. These were quiet flavours, meant for waking slowly, for soft mornings and quiet thoughts. One by one, the tavern's guests began to stir. The tanner's apprentice came first. He descended the stairs with a yawn and a hand combing through his unkempt hair. He nodded a sleepy good morning to the innkeeper, who poured him a cup of warm herb tea and gestured toward a bench by the fire. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The merchant followed, cloak folded neatly over one arm, his boots freshly brushed. He sat with a soft groan, placing a coin gently on the table, which the innkeeper swept into his apron without looking. Beside the fire, the kettle continued to steam, and a low rustle filled the room as chairs were straightened and blankets folded. By the time the sky had softened into pale grey, the bread was ready for baking. The innkeeper's wife opened the small stone oven, its heat already rising in slow waves, and placed the dough inside. The smell began to change almost immediately, yeasty, rich, and warm. It drifted into every corner of the tavern, wrapping around the beams and curling up the staircase. The couple from the night before came down together, hands brushing as they moved in silence. They smiled faintly at the others, their cheeks still pink with sleep. The minstrel was last. He moved slowly, as though waking not only from sleep, but from some dream that had clung to him tightly. They gathered at the long table near the hearth, each with a warm drink in hand. Their bodies leaned toward the fire, not out of chill, but out of instinct, like flowers turning to light. No one rushed. No one made plans aloud. The day would come on its own, gently and in time. When the bread was ready, it was placed on the table whole. Its crust was browned, split slightly at the top where steam had forced its way out. The innkeeper's wife cut it into thick slices, each one steaming at the center. A crock of soft butter, a pot of honey, and a small dish of salt were set beside it. The guests ate slowly, chewing in silence. The butter melted into the bread almost instantly. A few spoke in quiet tones, of the weather, of the road ahead, but most simply listened to the fire, to the sounds of the tavern waking, to the gentle clink of pottery, and the occasional sip of tea. Outside, the sky brightened to soft blue. A mist clung to the grass, and the trees dripped faintly from the dew. A cart rolled past, its wheels whispering over the dirt. Birds began to sing, their calls short and sweet, like questions asked and answered again and again. Inside, the morning lingered. No one left yet. No one stood too quickly. The fire continued to burn low and steady. The cat returned from its wanderings and leapt lightly onto a bench, curling beside the minstrel with a sigh. In this moment, the tavern was still a world unto itself, a cradle of warmth, of bread and breath, of stories still sleeping behind quiet eyes. And outside its timbered walls the day waited, soft-footed and patient. Later that morning, as the sun rose slowly over the fields, the tavern's door creaked open once again, not with the hush of nighttime, but with the soft welcome of day. The cool breeze that entered was sweet and damp, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. Beyond the threshold, the village stirred to life with gentle rhythm. The cobbled lane outside glistened faintly from the night's dew. Chickens scratched at the ground near the edge of the street, their soft clucks and low pecks the music of morning. A pair of geese wandered aimlessly near a trough, honking to themselves in low, conversational tones. Across the way, the blacksmith's forge remained silent, though a thin column of smoke had begun to rise from its chimney. The smell of coal and iron would come later. For now, it was the bread's warmth that lingered in the air, and the quiet rustle of cloth as shutters were opened one by one. The tavern's guests began to step out into the light. The tanner's apprentice left first, a small satchel slung over one shoulder, boots tied tightly. He turned at the threshold, nodding to the innkeeper, then set off down the lane with long, steady strides. His path led through the village and toward the open hills beyond, where the road faded into green. Not long after, the merchant followed. He paused on the step, adjusting the folds of his cloak, and breathed deeply. His pack was neat, his ledgers tucked away, and his boots clean. He cast a glance back at the tavern, just a moment, and then moved on, his stride deliberate, his eyes already on the bend in the road ahead. The couple lingered longer. They stood just outside the door, speaking in low tones that didn't carry. The woman traced a finger along the wooden sign that hung above the entrance, the weathered ox pulling its cart. The man pointed out something in the distance, a tree perhaps, or the way the morning mist curled along the edge of the nearby meadow. They stayed a while, hands barely brushing, before finally turning toward the narrow path that led down to the river. Inside, the traveller remained by the hearth. He had not risen early. He had no cart to catch, no goods to sell. His was the kind of journey that waited. He sat sipping from a fresh cup of tea, watching the play of sunlight as it filtered through the tavern's small windows. It caught on motes of dust, turning them into golden sparks that drifted and disappeared. The minstrel tuned his harp in a quiet corner. The notes, though few, were clear and patient. He played not for an audience now, but for the room itself, as though the old beams and worn stones needed music to start the day. The innkeeper moved between tasks with unhurried grace. He wiped a table here, checked the fire there. At times, he would pause, gaze toward the door, and then return to his work. The tavern did not empty all at once. It never did. People left as they had arrived, gently, like mist, rising from a morning field. The cat, awake again, stretched across the hearthstone, then padded toward the open door. It sat in the sun, blinking slowly, its tail flicking once or twice. A sparrow called from the edge of the roof. The cat did not move. Out on the road, a cart passed, pulled by a single patient horse. The driver lifted a hand in greeting, and the innkeeper nodded in return. The wheels clicked softly on the stones, then faded into the hush of the lane. Back inside, the traveller finally rose. He folded his cloak carefully and slung his satchel across his back. Before leaving, he placed a small object on the table, one of the items he had shown the night before. The carved whistle. Its wood was worn smooth, and its surface bore the marks of long handling. He did not speak, but he looked once more at the fire, then at the old beams above. The tavern had offered him a place to pause, a space to remember, and now it was time to go. He stepped outside, the door closing behind him with the same quiet sigh that had welcomed him the night before. The road stretched ahead, framed by trees and fields. It wound past the village well, past cottages with mossy roofs and low stone fences. Somewhere beyond the next hill, or the one after that, the next place waited. But for now, the traveller moved slowly, his feet light, his mind still resting in the warmth he carried with him. And the tavern, its door closed gently once more, settled back into silence. Another morning had come and gone, like a candle burning low and steady, its flame untroubled by time. As the sun climbed higher, brushing the rooftops with soft gold and coaxing bees from their hives, the tavern's quiet gave way to the low stirrings of midday. The breakfast guests had all departed, their boots leaving faint prints on the earth outside. In their place came a quieter rhythm, one shaped not by travellers or tales, but by the daily rhythm of the alewife. She moved through the space like a steady tide. Her sleeves were rolled, her braid looped twice around her head, and her steps made no more sound than a broom across clean wood. She had run the tavern's midday hours for many years, long before her hands grew lined or her eyes creased at the corners. Her husband kept the hearth and the books, but the ale was hers. Down in the cellar, cool and damp, she worked among the barrels. The stone steps were worn, and the low ceiling brushed her shoulder as she passed beneath a wooden beam. The air smelled of yeast and thyme. She moved a ladle through the top of a new brew, lifting it to the light of her lantern. The colour pleased her. Deep amber, with a slight haze that caught the flicker of flame just right. She tested it with care. A single sip, held on the tongue, studied like a poem. Then a nod, soft and satisfied. She replaced the lid, checked the spigots, and turned to the shelves, where jars of dried herbs stood beside bunches of dried rose hips and grains wrapped in cloth. Everything was as it should be. Back upstairs, the tavern had shifted into its midday calm. The fire was now a bed of warm coals, and only one candle still burned in the far corner, forgotten, but not unwelcome. A pair of elderly villagers sat by the wall, sharing a bowl of warm cider and talking low. Their voices rose and fell gently, like water lapping against a boat's hull. The alewife poured a cup for a black-cloaked friar who had appeared without sound, as they often did. He thanked her with a small bow and took his place by the window. His book was small and worn, its pages yellowed, its edges soft. He read slowly, lips moving faintly, though no sound escaped. She passed through the room, wiping a table here, adjusting a curtain there. She refilled the water jug and placed a dish of sugared plums near the hearth, just in case someone fancied something sweet. Outside, a few children passed by, laughing as they chased a wooden hoop down the lane. Their joy was quieted by the thick stone walls, entering only as a memory of sound. The cat watched them from the windowsill, tail flicking once before it leapt down and disappeared beneath a table. Sunlight streamed through the glass in slanted bands, lighting up the dust as it swirled gently in the air. In the kitchen, the alewife began preparations for the evening meal. She moved with a sense of rhythm and time, as though guided by music only she could hear. Onions were sliced, their scent sharp and earthy. Leeks and barley were set to soak. A hen, already plucked and cleaned, was nestled into a pot with cloves and garlic. The smell was soft and savoury, filling the tavern one breath at a time. She paused once, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked out the small kitchen window. Beyond the garden, bees moved lazily among the herbs, and the fence leaned ever so slightly from age. She noted a patch of mint growing wild, and made a mental note to gather some later. It would do well for the evening tea. Then she returned to her work. Bread was sliced and laid out in a basket. A wedge of hard cheese was unwrapped, its scent rich and nutty. A crock of salted butter sat ready, softened by the room's warmth. Everything was set out with care, not rushed, not showy. Just enough. Back in the main room, the friar had closed his book and now dozed gently, his head tilted back against the wall, his cup of ale untouched beside him. The elderly pair had gone, their table already cleared. Outside, the sun shifted lower in the sky, drawing longer shadows across the cobblestones. The alewife lit a new candle and placed it near the door. Its glow reached just far enough to greet the next guest, whenever they might arrive. And the tavern, wrapped in midday stillness, held its breath for a while. In the quiet hum of the cellar, in the softness of steam rising from the pot, and in the rhythm of the alewife's steps, the day drifted on, calm and steady, like a boat rocking gently on the water. By late afternoon, the sun dipped lower in the sky, bathing the village in a warm, golden hue. The air had softened, no longer crisp, but full of the gentle weight of the fading day. Shadows stretched long across the lane, and the tops of the trees glowed with pale fire as the light sifted through the leaves. The tavern's door opened once more, this time with a familiar creak. The merchant had returned. He stepped inside with a slight limp, the sort that comes from too much walking and not enough rest. His cloak was dusted at the hem, and his pack looked heavier than it had that morning. He paused just inside the threshold, allowing the coolness of the tavern to settle around him. The air was thick with the scent of roasted hen and simmering barley. The fire had been stoked again, and its warmth reached across the room like a quiet welcome. The innkeeper noticed him first, nodding from behind the bar. He gestured to the same table the merchant had sat at earlier, now wiped clean and set with a fresh cloth. The merchant offered a faint smile and made his way there, easing himself onto the bench with a slow exhale. The alewife appeared moments later, a clean cup in one hand and a gentle expression on her face. She poured him a warm drink without needing to ask. They exchanged no words, only a look that said, "You're back." That's enough. He sipped the drink. Herbed ale, softly spiced and not too strong. It brought colour back to his cheeks, and the lines around his eyes seemed to ease. He set his pack down beside him and stretched his legs out beneath the table. From the hearth, the cat watched him with one eye open, as if to confirm it was indeed the same man. Satisfied, it closed its eyes again and tucked its nose beneath its paw. As the room filled with the low rustle of firelight and footsteps, the merchant slowly unpacked a small roll of cloth. Inside were tiny trinkets, a carved comb, a spool of foreign thread, a brooch shaped like a curling leaf. None of them glittered, none were grand, but each had a quiet beauty, objects touched by time and travel. The minstrel had returned too, seated again in his corner with the harp across his lap. He plucked a slow, thoughtful melody that meandered through the room like a drifting breeze. It was not a song for attention, but for accompaniment, a sound to fill the spaces between stories and steps. A few other guests had trickled in. A potter with clay-stained hands, tired from the wheel. A baker's son, curious and still wearing the flour of the day's work. They took their places quietly, settling into the evening as one settles into a soft chair. The tavern was never loud, never hurried. Its comfort came not from abundance, but from ease. The merchant reached into a second pouch and withdrew a small scroll. He unrolled it slowly, scanning the neat rows of figures and notations. He worked as he drank, making tiny corrections with a charcoal stylus, occasionally pausing to listen to the harp or glance toward the kitchen. Soon, the alewife brought him a bowl of the evening meal, hen with onions and leeks, thickened with barley, and served with a wedge of bread still warm from the oven. The smell alone was enough to hush the room. He bowed his head slightly in thanks and took his first bite. He ate slowly, savouring each mouthful, as though the food itself told a story. As he finished, he leaned back with a sigh and closed his eyes, just for a moment. The fire crackled, the harp hummed. A breeze slipped in through the cracked window and stirred the corner of the curtain. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once and then fell silent. The merchant did not need to speak. His return had been quiet, as all things were in this place, but in the tilt of his shoulders, in the way his fingers now rested still, it was clear. He had found something here. Not riches, not excitement, but rest. A pause, a hearth to lean beside while the sun dipped low. And outside, the sky turned from gold to grey-blue, and the village slowed once more, preparing for the hush of night. As the light outside the tavern deepened into the gentle amber of early evening, the shadows inside grew longer and softer. The fire in the hearth, tended carefully throughout the day, cast a steady glow over the stone floor and low wooden beams. Its warmth filled the room, not with heat, but with a quiet sense of presence, like a sleeping dog at one's feet. The sounds had shifted once more. The bustle of late afternoon had faded, replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of the soft hours before dusk, a spoon against a bowl, the rustle of a cloak being folded, the hush of a low voice sharing a quiet remark, met with a nod rather than a reply. The innkeeper stood near the bar, polishing a clay cup, his eyes sweeping gently across the room. He seemed less like a man at work and more like a steward of calm, making sure nothing stirred too loudly or fell too far out of place. The alewife rested in a chair by the kitchen door, her hands wrapped around a warm cup. The curl of steam rose past her face, and her eyes were half closed, listening to the room rather than watching it. She had done all she needed. The meal was served, the tables were set, and now came the hour of gentle stillness, where everything simply was. The minstrel's harp lay untouched in his lap. He did not play, not yet. He sat listening to the fire, to the wind beyond the shutters, to the barely there creak of the old beams above. His fingers traced the strings now and then, as if remembering a song but choosing not to summon it just yet. A child sat near the hearth, her feet dangling from a low stool. She held a bit of bread in her hands and chewed slowly, watching the flames with the reverence only children and cats seem to understand. Her mother sat nearby, sewing a tear in a woolen sleeve, her needle moving through the cloth with silent care. The merchant remained at his table, a soft cloth now draped over his scroll. He did not write. He simply sat, his eyes drifting toward the window where the light had begun to fade. A fly buzzed softly against the glass before slipping away. The cat, in its usual fashion, stretched luxuriously and changed positions, now curled near the merchant's feet, purring softly. Outside, the street had quieted. A cart passed slowly, its wooden wheels creaking gently. The driver, hunched in a faded cloak, offered no call. Only the sound of hooves on stone marked his passing, fading into the golden hush of the evening. The tavern's door remained ajar for a while, letting in the last warmth of the day. The smell of earth and grass drifted in, along with the faint sound of distant birds settling in the hedgerows. A swallow darted low across the sky, chasing one final insect before nightfall. Then the innkeeper rose, stepped lightly across the floor, and closed the door with a slow, practiced hand. The latch clicked softly. The room, already dim, seemed to embrace the change, the fire now the brightest light, its glow licking at the walls and dancing in the bottoms of clay mugs. A guest near the fire began humming a lullaby under his breath. It was not meant for anyone. It was a habit, perhaps. A tune his grandmother once sang, or something heard on the road in younger days. It was simple, made of just a few notes, repeated and trailing off. No one asked him to stop. In this hour, between the day and the night, there was no need for plans or purpose. The tavern held everyone as they were, tired or quiet, hungry or full, alone or near others. It did not ask questions. It did not offer distractions, only the soft permission to sit still and be. And as the light outside faded further, giving way to the first cool breath of night, the tavern settled once more into its old and familiar rhythm. A rhythm not measured by clocks or bells, but by footsteps and firelight, by bread and breath, by the soft hours before dusk. Night had now fallen fully, and the tavern glowed like a lantern nestled in the heart of the village. Outside, the lanes were quiet, the fields hushed beneath a blanket of mist, and only the softest hoot of an owl stirred the silence. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, and candles had been lit one by one, their golden light painting long, trembling shadows on the walls. Each candle flame flickered as if caught in a quiet breath. Their wax dripped slowly down thick tapers, collecting in uneven pools on wooden sconces and clay dishes. The scent of beeswax lingered in the air, sweet and faint, mingling with the last traces of supper, barley broth, baked onions, and rosemary-scented meat, now only a memory on the plates. The tavern's guests had drawn closer together now, drawn not by noise or excitement, but by the warmth of company. Voices were softer, laughter subdued, and the mood had settled into something deeply peaceful. It was not the silence of sleep, but of comfort, of stories shared in gentle tones and thoughts passed between friends like folded notes. At a table near the center of the room, a quiet game of cards had begun. 4 men sat around the table, their sleeves rolled and their eyes calm. The cards were handmade, their edges worn and softened from long use. Each bore simple illustrations in faded ink, crowns and cups, swords and suns. The deck had passed through many hands and many places, but here it was dealt with slow deliberation. The rules of the game were simple, and no one kept score too tightly. It was not about winning, but about the passing of time, about the curl of smoke rising from a shared pipe, about the clink of pottery as mugs were set gently down, about the glance exchanged when a lucky card turned, and the quiet chuckle that followed. The merchant joined in after a time, invited with a nod. He took the 5th seat without a word, laying a coin on the table that no one bothered to take. The game shifted to include him, the rhythm unchanged. The cards whispered against the table. Mugs were refilled. Someone murmured a story about a lost chicken found atop a thatched roof, and soft laughter moved around the room like wind in the grass. Elsewhere by the hearth, the minstrel strummed his harp with fingers so light they barely seemed to touch the strings. He did not sing, only played. The tune was round and slow, like a wheel turning gently through water. A lullaby without words, a melody for listening more than hearing. A few guests sat nearby with cups in their hands, gazing into the fire. Their faces glowed with the light, and their expressions were unreadable, softened by thought or memory. One woman hummed quietly to herself, her voice low, her eyes half closed. Near the back wall, the alewife polished spoons, each motion slow and circular. She was not tired, only still. Her husband leaned beside her, arms folded, watching the room with quiet satisfaction. This was how the evenings always were, and always should be. Outside, the moon rose above the rooftops, silver and round. Its light filtered through the shutters, falling in thin stripes across the floor. The night air pressed gently against the windows, and a light frost began to gather on the edges of the glass. Inside, the warmth remained. The fire whispered and sighed. The candles flickered and bent. The game of cards went on without tension, without competition, the players content with the rhythm of turn and reply. It was the kind of night that did not announce itself. No grand events, no important words. Just the quiet presence of people in one place, held by comfort, by shared warmth, by the hush of the late hour. And as the night deepened and the room grew stiller still, the tavern felt like a heartbeat, slow, steady, and strong. A place wrapped in light and calm, holding back the dark just enough for rest, just enough for peace. It was the deepest hour of the night now. The world outside had sunk into silence, a silence so complete it felt sacred. The stars above the village glimmered softly, their light cool and distant, scattered across the velvet dark like tiny bits of frost. The moon had shifted westward, casting a pale glow over the rooftops and silvering the tops of hedgerows. Inside the tavern, the evening had thinned to its final threads. The card game had ended quietly. The players had stood, stretched their arms and exchanged small nods before drifting to their rooms or out into the night. The merchant, the last to rise, had folded his cloth once more, tucked his cards away, and left a small token behind, a polished stone from a distant river, smooth and rounded like a drop of glass. The harp no longer sounded. It rested beside the minstrel now, who leaned back in his chair with his eyes closed, breathing slowly. The cat lay curled on his lap, its body rising and falling in time with his chest, both of them deep in the calm beyond wakefulness. Only the innkeeper and the alewife remained at their posts, though they moved very little now. The innkeeper sat near the hearth, legs stretched before him, watching the fire. The alewife stood by the bar, polishing nothing, her hands still, her gaze turned inward. Their work was done for the day, and now they kept watch, not out of duty, but out of a quiet affection for the place they had tended for so long. The fire, their constant companion, had burned low. Its flames had shrunk into a soft bed of coals, red and pulsing like the last breath of day. Thin wisps of smoke drifted upward, caught in the shaft of moonlight falling through the narrow chimney. Now and then a log would sigh and settle, sending a small burst of light across the room. The walls of the tavern, once alive with conversation and music, had fallen into stillness. But it was not an empty silence. It was full of things unspoken, of memories held in wood grain and stone, of laughter still echoing in the rafters, of kindness exchanged in glances. The room, in its quiet, seemed to remember it all. The candle flames trembled but did not falter. A few had burned low, leaving thick puddles of wax around their bases. The air carried their scent, faint, warm, and clean. The shadows on the walls shifted slightly with each flicker, dancing slowly like thoughts too gentle to disturb. Upstairs, the guests slept soundly. The tanner's apprentice, worn from his day's journey, lay wrapped in a woolen blanket, dreaming of faraway hills. The couple, still close, but not quite touching, slept in stillness, their breaths rising and falling like waves. The merchant, careful even in sleep, rested with his pack against the wall, one hand loosely wrapped around the strap. In their dreams, perhaps they walked wooded paths, or stood beneath summer rain, or listened once more to the notes of the harp that still lingered in the air. In the quiet that held them, the tavern became part of their dreaming, a place more imagined than real, and yet more real than most. The innkeeper, finally rising, added one last log to the fire. It hissed softly as it caught, the flames licking gently along its edge. He stood for a long moment, one hand resting on the mantel, then turned and met his wife's eyes. She nodded once, slowly. They moved through the room like dancers in an old ritual, snuffing the candles one by one, leaving only the fire to watch over the room. With each extinguished flame, the shadows deepened, the silence thickened, and the stillness grew more complete. At last, with a quiet step, they ascended the stairs, the floorboards creaking beneath them like sleepy sighs. The door to their chamber closed gently, and the tavern was left to its rest. Now only the embers remained, glowing in their hearthbed. Their light painted soft patterns on the walls, like the last lines of a lullaby. The cat stirred but did not wake. The harp gleamed faintly in the shadows. And the tavern, full of stories and footsteps and warmth, exhaled one final time into the night. Nothing moved. Nothing spoke. Only peace remained. In the quiet hours before dawn, long after the last candle had faded and the coals in the hearth had dulled to a muted red, a soft patter began upon the tavern roof. At first it was no more than a whisper, a delicate tapping against the thatch as if the sky were testing its voice. Then came a steadier rhythm, gentle and even, like fingers drumming softly on cloth. Rain, light, cold, and kind, the kind that fell straight down, without wind, without storm. The tavern did not wake, not really. It only listened. The rain's sound filled the room in the way a lullaby does, wrapping itself around beams and floorboards, seeping into the stone walls. It dripped from the eaves in slow, even intervals, landing in puddles that formed in the dirt outside. The windows wore a sheen of moisture, and droplets traced lazy paths down the glass. Inside, nothing moved. Upstairs, the guests remained in sleep. The rhythm of the rain lulled them deeper, turning their dreams toward riverbanks and cool forests. The couple shared their small bed, their breaths matched like the rise and fall of a calm tide. The merchant, turned on his side, had one hand tucked beneath his cheek, his face softened in repose. The cat lay curled on the floor now, near the door, where a draught carried the scent of damp moss and earth. The innkeeper, still in sleep, stirred once, and then stilled. He had heard the rain, not fully, not in thought, but in the part of him attuned to the tavern's sounds. It soothed him, and he let it carry him deeper into rest. Downstairs, the fire had gone out. Only the faintest glow lingered in the ashes, like the last ember of a dream. The room was dark now, but not cold. The stone held the heat of the day before, and the thick walls kept the night's chill at bay. On the table nearest the hearth, a single candle stood untouched, its wax hardened and slightly tilted. Near it lay the polished stone left by the merchant, glistening faintly in the shadow, a memory of warmth, of presence. The scent of yesterday still lingered in the air, rosemary, wood smoke, and the sweetness of baked bread. These scents, mingled now with the smell of rain, gave the tavern a kind of hush that went beyond silence. It was the stillness of a place well used and well loved, a place allowed to breathe in peace. The thatch above did its work, catching the rainfall, letting it trickle down its slope and off its edge. The sound was constant but never loud. A comfort, a murmur from the sky to the earth, asking nothing, disturbing no one. Outside, the lane had turned soft underfoot. Puddles reflected the dim light of the fading moon, and the gutters ran quietly with thin streams. The trees stood motionless, their leaves dripping slowly. A dog barked once in the distance, then was silent again. The tavern held itself still, a presence wrapped in slumber. Time moved slowly in the rain. The hours passed, but without notice. Shadows shifted almost imperceptibly, and the first hints of morning light were no more than a softening of the dark. Then, as dawn began to stretch its pale fingers across the edge of the sky, the rain eased. Its rhythm slowed, thinned, then stopped altogether, leaving behind a world washed clean. Water clung to every leaf, every beam and shutter, as if the village had been dipped in silver. The silence afterward was not empty. It was full of what had passed, the song of the rain, the warmth of sleep, the breath of stone and thatch. And inside the tavern, as the world outside began to stir once more, the stillness remained, just a little longer. The peace, deep and undisturbed, held the room like a long exhale. like the final note of a song played softly in the dark. The rain had passed. In its wake, the morning unfolded slowly, as though the earth itself was reluctant to stir. A pale, silvery light filtered through the softened sky, and the village lay still beneath a sheen of dew. Each cobblestone glistened. Each leaf held a bead of water like a pearl. A mist lingered at the edges of the fields, curling around hedgerows and fence posts in gentle, shifting veils. The tavern, still wrapped in the hush of early light, began to rouse from its slumber. A creak stirred on the upper floor, one of the inn's simple wooden doors opening on old hinges. Soft footsteps crossed the boards, followed by the faint sound of a basin being filled. Someone was washing their face, the splash quiet and careful. Another door opened, a muted yawn echoed, then silence returned for a while. Downstairs, the hearth remained cold. The ashes were soft and white, scattered like snow across the stone. A single log had been placed the night before in readiness, and beside it, a small bundle of kindling waited patiently. The innkeeper would be down soon. A robin called from the eaves, its song clear and clean. It hopped along the edge of the thatch, shaking droplets from its feathers, then settled again, watching the quiet yard below. The first to rise properly was the alewife. Her steps were slow but sure. She lit a small lantern in the kitchen and opened the back door, letting in the cool morning air. A chill drifted in, carrying with it the sense of wet grass and distant wood smoke. She breathed it in and stood for a moment, her eyes closed, her hands folded before her. Then she moved into the rhythm of morning, lighting the stove, setting water to boil, and slicing the first loaf of bread from the previous day. The tavern room filled with faint light. It slipped through the windows in narrow beams, golden at the edges, touching the floor and walls like a blessing. The table near the fire caught the first of it. So did the harp, resting beside the minstrel's chair, its strings glinting like thread in the stillness. Soon the innkeeper joined her. His hair was tousled, his eyes still heavy with sleep, but his motions were practiced and calm. He added kindling to the hearth, struck flint to steel, and coaxed the first flame of the day into life. It caught slowly, then flared softly, casting long shadows behind the chairs. The warmth began to rise again, unseen but unmistakable. One by one, the guests came down. The merchant, brushing his cloak and straightening his collar. The tanner's apprentice, boots scuffed, hands tucked into his sleeves. The couple, smiling sleepily, their eyes still soft from dreams. They nodded their good mornings, took their seats, accepted cups of warm tea or broth without a word. The room did not need conversation yet. The fire spoke for everyone. The cat, as always, descended last. It slipped down the stairs in perfect silence, pausing on each step as though considering whether to return to bed. Finally, it padded over to the hearth and curled into the very center of the heat, resting its head on its paws. Outside, the village had begun to stir. A wheel turned slowly down the lane. A door creaked open across the square. But within the tavern, time moved differently. The day would unfold gently, one breath at a time. Steam rose from a pot on the stove. The scent of porridge filled the air. Oats and cinnamon, sweetened faintly with honey. A basket of fresh herbs sat on the table, their leaves still damp from the garden. Mint, thyme, and marjoram, their colours bright against the wood. As the room brightened further, the guests began to speak in low tones, not of troubles, not of burdens, but of small, gentle things. The sound of the rain in the night, a dream of a green meadow, the memory of a festival from the spring before last. Their words, like the rain, fell softly and disappeared into the warmth. The minstrel plucked a few tentative notes on his harp. Not a tune, just a sound to let the room know he was awake. The merchant smiled. The couple listened. The fire crackled quietly, and the tavern, once again full of warmth, of breath, of morning light, lived another beginning, slow and calm, beneath the eaves, wrapped in quiet peace. By mid-morning, the mist had lifted. The clouds had thinned, letting down golden light that poured softly across the fields and rooftops. The tavern's windows shone faintly in the sun, their panes speckled with drying raindrops that shimmered like tiny beads of glass. Outside, the lane was drying slowly, its puddles shrinking into the warm earth, its stones warm beneath careful steps. Inside the tavern, the morning meal had passed. The guests lingered a little longer, sipping the last of their tea, fingers tracing idle shapes on the wooden tables. There was no rush. Time moved like the smoke from the rekindled hearth, steady, curling, gentle. Conversations came and went, low and meandering. The clink of pottery had softened. The harp rested in the minstrel's lap, silent once more. One by one, preparations for departure began, but always in silence, always with care. The merchant gathered his belongings with the method of habit. Each scroll, each tool, each scrap of parchment was tucked into its place. He tied his cloak with a clean, neat knot, then reached for the polished stone he'd left behind the night before. For a moment he paused. Then, smiling to himself, he left it where it was. The tanner's apprentice stood in the doorway, adjusting the strap of his satchel. He looked out at the brightening village, his eyes wide, then glanced back toward the hearth. The warmth still touched the back of his legs. He nodded, more to himself than to anyone else, then stepped into the light. The couple was last to leave. Their hands now held each other's easily, and they moved without words. The woman pressed her palm softly against the doorframe, as if committing it to memory, while the man exchanged a final look with the innkeeper. They walked out side by side, the tavern's door swinging shut behind them with its usual creak and soft thud. Now the room was nearly empty. The fire still burned, though lower now. The cat lay stretched before it, belly exposed to the warmth, one paw twitching in a dream. The air held the last traces of the breakfast herbs, mint and thyme, clove and barley, and the faintest scent of smoke. The minstrel stood and walked to the door. He looked once more over his shoulder at the quiet room, then stepped out into the sun with his harp slung gently across his back. The sound of the breeze lifted for a moment, then faded. Only the innkeeper and the alewife remained. They moved slowly through the space, clearing dishes, brushing crumbs from tables, folding the linens. The innkeeper picked up the merchant's stone, turning it over in his palm before placing it in a small wooden box beside the hearth. It joined other such treasures: buttons, bits of ribbon, a single brass bell, a feathered quill, all left behind, all remembered. The alewife opened the back door again, letting in the clean morning air. The garden glowed in the sun, and the herbs danced faintly in the breeze. She reached down and plucked a sprig of rosemary, rolling it between her fingers, its scent rising fresh and strong. Together they stood in the doorway, looking out at the lane that led away from the tavern, down through the village and onward toward the hills. The same road taken by countless feet, the same path that curved into the unknown. The inn would fill again. More travellers would come, and the fire would burn again tonight. But for now, it was quiet, the stillness of a place between stories. And as the innkeeper gently closed the door, the tavern sighed, settling once more into peace. Thanks for watching this far. I truly appreciate you more than you know. If you like this story, please like and subscribe.